The cantina on Kepler Prime was quiet that night. Only a few tables were filled with travelers and traders. In the darkest corner, away from the main lights, sat a figure that made most people look away quickly. Commander Zethkar was hard to miss, even when he tried to hide in the shadows. His blue-green skin was covered in scars that told stories of old battles. Where his left eye stalk should have been, there was only smooth scar tissue. His right arm was made of metal and plastic, a replacement for the one he lost 30 years ago. The young Kalari soldiers at the nearby table kept stealing glances at him, whispering among themselves. Zethkar lifted his glass of fermented kelp wine to his lips with his good hand. It was his third glass tonight, but the memories were still too clear. They always were. The younglings at the next table were talking about humans again. They always did when they thought he could not hear them. "Commander," one of the young soldiers finally spoke up. His name was Vextar, barely past his first molting. "We heard you fought in the human war. Is it true what they say about them?" Zethkar set down his glass and looked at the group of cadets. 6 young Kalari, fresh from the academy with bright eyes and unmarked shells. They had no idea what real war looked like. They had never seen what humans could do when they were backed into a corner. "What do they say about humans in the academy now?" Zethkar asked, his voice rough from years of shouting orders across battlefields. "They say humans are dangerous," another cadet said. "They say that is why we made peace with them. They fight dirty and use weapons that break the rules of war." Zethkar made a sound that might have been laughter, but there was no joy in it. "Sit down, younglings. Let me tell you about humans. Let me tell you why the Kalari Dominion, masters of 1,000 worlds, learned to fear a species that had barely left their home system." The cadets moved their chairs closer. The rest of the cantina seemed to fade away as Zethkar began his story. "It was 32 years ago when I first encountered humans. I was a young officer then, commanding a reconnaissance unit in the Outer Rim. The Dominion was expanding, as it always did. We had claimed the Zirion system for its rich mineral deposits. There was supposed to be nothing there but rocks and mining equipment." Zethkar paused to take another drink. The kelp wine helped dull the sharp edges of memory, but it never made them disappear completely. "We detected a small research station on Zirion 7. 12 humans, mostly scientists and engineers. They had been studying the planet's geology for their mining company. Standard procedure was simple: land, secure the area, relocate any civilians to neutral space. Clean and easy." One of the cadets leaned forward. "But it was not clean and easy, was it?" "No," Zethkar said quietly. "Nothing with humans is ever clean and easy. When we sent the standard surrender demand, they responded with a simple message: come and take it. We thought they were foolish. We thought they did not understand what they were facing." The old commander's metal fingers drummed against the table as he remembered. "I was ordered to take a full battalion and clear the station. 300 of our best soldiers against 12 humans. It should have been over in an hour." "What happened?" Vextar asked. "Captain Jake Morrison happened," Zethkar said. "He was their leader, a mining engineer who had served in the human military years before. When we landed, we expected to find scared scientists hiding in their laboratory. Instead, we found a fortress." Zethkar's good eye stared into the distance, seeing things that happened decades ago. They had torn apart their mining equipment and turned it into weapons. Their particle accelerators, designed to break up rock formations, were now pointing at our landing zone. Their drilling lasers had been mounted on defensive positions around the station. "But surely your superior numbers and training," one cadet began. "Numbers mean nothing when your enemy knows the ground better than you do," Zethkar interrupted. "The humans had been on that planet for 6 months before we arrived. They knew every cave, every rock formation, every unstable cliff face. Morrison had turned the entire mountainside into a weapon." The commander took another drink before continuing. Dr. Lisa Parker, their xenobiologist, had been studying the local wildlife. She knew which creatures were territorial, which ones were poisonous, which ones could be attracted with certain sounds or smells. While we were trying to advance on their position, she was releasing swarms of acid-spitting insects into our ranks. "That is against the rules of war," one cadet protested. Humans do not fight by our rules, Zethkar said. They fight to win. Engineer Pete Collins had rigged their life support system to produce toxic gases. Not lethal, but enough to make our soldiers sick and confused. Every breath we took in that place was a risk. The cantina seemed to grow quieter as other patrons began to listen to the old warrior's tale. Stories of the human war were rare. Most veterans did not like to talk about it. We spent 3 days trying to take that station, Zethkar continued. 3 days of fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. They used the mining tunnels to move around underground. They would attack from one position, then disappear and hit us from somewhere else entirely. How did they communicate without you detecting their signals? Vextar asked. They used the mining equipment itself as a communication system, Zethkar explained. Collins had figured out how to send messages through the rock using seismic vibrations. They were coordinating their attacks through the ground itself. The old commander's voice grew softer, more distant. On the second night, they hit our command post. Morrison and 3 others somehow made it past all our sensors and security. They did not try to kill our officers. Instead, they destroyed our communication array and stole our tactical computers. By morning, they knew our battle plans better than we did. But you had 300 soldiers, another cadet said. How could 12 humans hold you off? Because they were not fighting like soldiers, Zethkar replied. They were fighting like humans. Parker had trained the local wildlife to attack anything that smelled like Kalari pheromones. Collins had rigged motion sensors throughout the mountain to trigger rock slides and cave-ins. Every step we took was a trap waiting to happen. The commander paused, his metal hand clenching into a fist. And then there was Morrison himself. He seemed to be everywhere at once. One moment he would be sniping at our advance units with a mining laser from a clifftop. The next he would be setting off explosives in our supply depot. He never slept, never rested, never made the same mistake twice. How did it end? One of the younger cadets asked quietly. Zethkar's expression grew dark. On the 3rd day we finally surrounded the station. Morrison's people were out of ammunition, out of supplies, out of options. Any reasonable enemy would have surrendered. But humans are not reasonable. The old warrior finished his drink in one long swallow. Morrison activated the mining charges. All of them. At once. He brought down half the mountain on our heads. When the dust settled, only half my battalion was still alive. The research station was gone. The humans were gone. And I was buried. Under a pile of rocks with a crushed arm and a face full of shrapnel. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. They all died, Vextar whispered. No, Zethkar said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. That was the most human thing of all. They had escape tunnels. Morrison and his people had planned their own retreat route before the Ur battle even started. While we were digging our survivors out of the rubble, they were already 50 kilometers away, heading for the extraction point where a human ship picked them up. The old commander looked at each of the young faces around him. That was my first lesson about humans. They do not just fight to win, they fight to survive, and they are very, very good at both. One of the cadets swallowed hard. What happened to Captain Morrison? He lived through the war, Zethkar said. All of them did. Parker, Collins, Morrison, the whole team. I met Morrison again, years later, during the peace negotiations. He had become a teacher by then, training young humans and Kalari to work together in deep space. The old warrior stood up slowly, his metal arm whirring softly as he moved. That is why we fear humans, younglings. Not because they are cruel or evil, but because when they decide to fight, they fight with everything they have. They turn their tools into weapons, their knowledge into tactics, and their determination into victory. As Zethkar walked toward the door, he turned back one last time. Remember this story when you meet humans in your service. Treat them with respect. Because if you do not, you might learn firsthand why the Kalari Dominion chose peace over war. The cantina remained silent long after the old commander left. the weight of his words hanging in the air like smoke. The next evening, the young Kalari cadets were waiting for Zethkar when he arrived at the cantina. They had taken the same table as before, but now they sat quietly, watching the door. When the old commander walked in, they immediately stood, up in respect. Zethkar nodded to them and took his usual seat. The bartender brought him his kelp wine without being asked. The commander took a sip and looked at the eager faces around him. "You came back," he said simply. "We want to hear more, Commander," Vextar said, "about the humans, about the war." Zethkar was quiet for a long moment, then he began to speak. "After Zirion 7, the High Command decided that humans were more dangerous than we first thought. They sent bigger fleets, better weapons, more soldiers. We thought we could crush them with overwhelming force. We were wrong." The old warrior's metal fingers traced patterns on the table as he remembered. The Battle of Crimson Nebula happened 6 months later. I had been promoted to field commander after my recovery. The Dominion wanted to take control of the nebula because it was rich in rare minerals. Human mining operations were scattered throughout the area. "How many humans were there?" one of the cadets asked. "Intelligence said maybe 50,000 civilians and a few hundred military personnel," Zethkar replied. "We brought 3 battle fleets, over 200 ships, and 50,000 soldiers. The humans had 1 small military base and a handful of patrol ships." The commander paused to drink. What we did not know was that the humans had been expecting us. They had been preparing for months under the command of Colonel Sam Wright. "What was special about this Wright?" Vextar asked. "Wright was not like Morrison," Zethkar said slowly. "Morrison was a fighter, a warrior who used his hands and his tools. Wright was something else. He fought with minds, not just weapons. He understood that the real battle was not about ships and guns. It was about fear." The old commander's good eye stared into the distance. Wright had studied our species for years. He knew our biology, our psychology, our fears. When we entered the nebula, we thought we were hunting scattered human settlements. Instead, we found ourselves being hunted. "What do you mean?" one of the younger cadets asked. Wright's people had hidden recording devices throughout the nebula. They captured our communication frequencies and learned our language. But they did not use this knowledge to listen to our plans. They used it to drive us insane. Zethkar's voice grew quieter. In the middle of the night shift, when our crews were trying to rest, the humans would broadcast sounds over our ship communication systems. Not human sounds. Sounds from our own homeworld. Ancient predator calls from the deep forests where our ancestors once hid in fear. The cadets looked at each other nervously. They all knew those sounds from their childhood nightmares. The humans had somehow found recordings of the skullworms, the great hunters that once preyed on our people, Zethkar continued. They would play these sounds at frequencies that made our carapaces itch and our minds fill with panic. Soldiers who had never seen combat would wake up screaming. Veterans with decades of experience would refuse to leave their quarters. "That is not honorable warfare," one cadet protested. "There is no honor in war," Zethkar said sharply. "Only victory and defeat." The humans understood this. They were not trying to kill us with these sounds. They were trying to break our will to fight. And it was working. The commander took another drink before continuing. Wright's ground forces were just as clever. Staff Sergeant Maria Lopez led night raids that seemed to come from nowhere. Our sensors would detect movement in one area, but when we sent troops to investigate, they would find nothing. Then our supply depots would explode on the other side of the base. "How were they moving without being detected?" Vextar asked. Lopez had studied our sensor technology, Zethkar explained. She knew that our equipment was designed to detect Kalari movement patterns. Humans move differently than we do. Their heat signatures are different. Their electromagnetic fields are different. Lopez trained her people to move in ways that our sensors could not recognize. The old warrior's mettle, hand clenched. They would crawl through ventilation systems, hide in cargo containers, even disguise themselves as maintenance equipment. One night, 3 of our guard posts were destroyed by what we thought were cleaning robots. They were actually humans, in disguise. "What about their leader, this Wright?" another cadet asked. Wright himself was like a ghost, Zethkar said. He would appear on our communication channels speaking perfect Kalari, taunting our commanders. He knew their names, their histories, their fears. He would tell them about their families back home, describe their children's schools, mention their favorite foods. The commander's voice became almost a whisper. How did he know these things? How could a human know details about Kalari officers that were classified at the highest levels? It drove our commanders to paranoia. They began to suspect their own people of being spies. Was someone giving him information? Vexitar asked. No, Zethkar said. Wright was simply better at gathering intelligence than we were at protecting it. He had people watching our supply convoys, our communication relays, our personnel transfers. Every piece of information about our forces was being collected and analyzed. The old commander leaned forward. Lieutenant Ben Carter was Wright's explosives expert, but Carter did not just blow things up. He was an artist of destruction. He would plant bombs that did not kill people, but destroyed morale instead. What do you mean? One of the cadets asked. Carter would blow up our mess halls during meal times, but only after everyone had left. He would destroy our recreation facilities, our communication centers, our medical supplies. He never killed anyone, but he made life miserable for every soldier in our fleet. Zethkar's expression grew darker. The worst part was that Carter's bombs were made from our own equipment. He would steal parts from our ships, our weapons, our computers, and turn them into explosives. We were literally being destroyed by our own technology. How long did this go on? Vextar asked. 3 weeks, Zethkar replied. 3 weeks of psychological warfare that broke the spirit of our forces. By the end, our soldiers were afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to trust their own equipment. Wright had turned our entire fleet into a collection of nervous wrecks. The commander paused to finish his drink. And then Wright played his final card. Sergeant Danny Rodriguez was a communications specialist who had been studying our language and customs for months. He managed to infiltrate our command ship by posing as a maintenance worker. How did he do that? One of the cadets asked in amazement. Rodriguez had somehow obtained a complete Kalari maintenance uniform, including identity documents and work orders. Zethkar explained. He spoke our language perfectly, knew our customs, even walked like one of us. He spent 2 weeks working on our ship, fixing equipment, eating in our mess halls, sleeping in our quarters. The old warrior's voice filled with reluctant admiration. During those 2 weeks, Rodriguez had access to everything. Our navigation systems, our communication arrays, our weapons control systems. He could have sabotaged any of it, could have killed hundreds of our people, but he did not. Why not? Vextar asked. Because Wright had taught him that the best victory is the one that ends the war, Zethkar said. When Rodriguez finally revealed himself, he did not destroy our ship. Instead, he reprogrammed our navigation system to broadcast our exact position to every human ship in the sector. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background noise seemed to have stopped. Within hours, our command ship was surrounded by human patrol vessels. Zethkar continued, but they did not attack. Instead, Wright himself came aboard under a flag of truce. He wanted to talk. What did he say? One of the cadets whispered. He told our admiral that the war could end right there, right then, Zethkar said. No more soldiers needed to die. No more ships needed to be destroyed. He offered to escort our fleet safely out of the nebula if we agreed to withdraw from human space. The old commander looked at each of the young faces around him. Our admiral was furious. He demanded to know how Wright had infiltrated our ship, how he had turned our own equipment against us, how he had broken our spirits without firing a shot. What did Wright tell him? Vextar asked. Wright said something I will never forget. Zethkar replied. He said, Admiral, you came here to fight a war. We came here to end one. The question is which one of us succeeded. The old warrior stood up slowly. That was when I realized that humans do not just fight differently than we do. They think differently. They do not see war as a contest of strength or courage. They see it as a problem to be solved. As Zethkar walked toward the door, he turned back one last time. Wright let our fleet go that day. 3 weeks later, the High Command ordered a full withdrawal from human space. They had realized what I learned at Crimson Nebula. Humans are Not just dangerous because they fight well, they are dangerous because they fight smart. The cantina remained quiet long after the old commander left. The young cadets sat in silence, trying to understand what they had just heard. Outside the windows, human and Kalari ships moved peacefully through space, working together under the treaties that had ended the war. The third night, more Kalari had joined the group around Zethkar's table. Word had spread through the station about the old commander's stories. Young soldiers, traders, even some civilians sat quietly in the cantina, waiting for him to speak. Zethkar looked around at all the faces watching him. Some were curious, others were afraid. All of them wanted to understand what had happened during the war years. "Tonight I will tell you about New Geneva," he said quietly. "This story is different from the others. It is darker. It will show you something about humans that still haunts my dreams." The room became completely silent. Even the bartender stopped cleaning glasses to listen. New Geneva was humanity's primary military academy world. Zethkar began. It was where they trained their officers, their engineers, their strategists. The High Command decided that if we could capture this world, we could break the human military leadership for a generation. The old commander's metal fingers drummed against the table. "We sent our largest invasion force. 300,000 soldiers, 50 capital ships, everything we needed to crush any resistance. The planet had maybe 20,000 military personnel and 500,000 civilians." "Those are good odds," one of the young soldiers said. "That is what we thought," Zethkar replied. "We were wrong. What we found on New Geneva was not just an army. We found an entire population that refused to surrender." Zethkar paused to take a drink. "The invasion began at dawn. Our dropships landed near the capital city, expecting to face the human military garrison. Instead, we found ourselves fighting the entire city." "What do you mean?" Vextar asked. "The humans had turned their whole city into a fortress," Zethkar explained. "Every building was a defensive position. Every street was a trap. Every civilian was a soldier. The military academy was run by Principal Helen Davis, but she was not hiding in her office waiting for rescue. She was on the front lines with her students." The old warrior's voice grew heavy. Davis had turned her school into a command center. Her students, some barely old enough to be called adults, were fighting alongside seasoned soldiers. They were not being used as cannon fodder. They were being treated as equals. "Children fighting in war?" one of the civilians asked, horrified. "Human children are not like our younglings," Zethkar said. "By the time they reach their final school years, they are already thinking like adults." Davis had been training them not just in academics, but in strategy, tactics, and leadership. The commander's good eye stared into the distance. "I remember a human youngling named Casey Williams. She was 16 years old, barely past her first molting by our standards. But she led a unit that destroyed 3 of our heavy assault mechs, using nothing but scavenged parts and textbook chemistry." "How is that possible?" Vextar asked. "Williams had been studying engineering at the academy," Zethkar explained. "When the invasion began, she and her classmates raided the chemistry labs and the engineering workshops. They built electromagnetic pulse devices using equipment meant for teaching." The old commander shook his head in amazement. These were not weapons of war. They were science projects turned into instruments of destruction. Williams and her team would hide in the school buildings waiting for our mechs to get close, then trigger their devices. Our most advanced war machines would simply shut down. "What about the adults? The real soldiers?" one of the listeners asked. "The human military worked with the civilians as partners, not as commanders," Zethkar said. Mayor Frank Thompson had organized the entire city into a resistance network. Every shop owner, every teacher, every maintenance worker had a role to play in the defense. The commander's voice became quieter. Thompson was not a soldier. He was a politician, an administrator. But he understood something about war that our generals did not. He knew that the real strength of any force is not in its weapons but in its people. "How did a politician fight soldiers?" someone asked. "Thompson did not fight us directly," Zethkar replied. "He fought us with organization. Every human in the city knew exactly what to do when we arrived. The shopkeepers had hidden weapons and supplies in their stores. The teachers had turned their classrooms into medical stations. The maintenance workers had rigged the city's infrastructure to be used as weapons. Zethkar took another drink. But the most remarkable human was a youngling named Alex Chen. He was only 16 like Williams, but he had a mind that worked differently than anyone I had ever encountered. What made him special? Vextar asked. Chen had been studying both electronics and Kalari technology, the commander explained. When our forces landed, he began building devices that could disrupt our equipment. Not destroy it, but confuse it. Our sensors would show targets that were not there. Our communication systems would receive false messages. Our weapons would fire at empty air. The old warrior's expression grew thoughtful. Chen was working with his teacher, Dr. Rachel Stone, who had been studying Kalari biology as part of a cultural exchange program. Stone knew more about our species than most of our own scientists. How did she use that knowledge? One of the civilians asked. Stone developed chemical agents that were not lethal to us but made us sick and confused, Zethkar said. She knew exactly which compounds would affect our nervous systems, which frequencies would disrupt our hearing, which smells would trigger our flight responses. The commander paused, his metal hand clenching. But Stone was not trying to kill us. She was trying to save lives on both sides. Her chemicals would incapacitate our soldiers without permanent harm. It was warfare, but it was also mercy. Why would she show mercy to her enemies? Someone asked. Because humans have something we did not understand then, Zethkar replied. They have what they call a moral code. Even in war, even when fighting for their lives, they try to minimize suffering. The old warrior's voice became heavy with emotion. I learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. On the 5th day of the siege, I was leading an assault on the medical district. We had taken heavy casualties and needed to prevent the humans from treating their wounded. Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. During the attack, I was hit by one of Chen's EMP devices. My prosthetic arm stopped working and I was trapped under debris when a building collapsed. I was bleeding, unconscious, completely helpless. What happened? Vexitar whispered. I woke up in a human medical station, Zethkar said. A human medic named Nancy Torres had pulled me out of the rubble and was treating my wounds. She had risked her life to save an enemy soldier. The cantina was completely silent now. Everyone was staring at the old commander. Torres could have let me die, Zethkar continued. It would have been easy. One less enemy to worry about. Instead, she used her medical supplies, her time, her skills to keep me alive. She treated me with the same care she gave to wounded humans. Why? One of the cadets asked. I asked her that same question, Zethkar replied. She told me something I will never forget. She said, because you are someone's son, someone's friend, someone's responsibility. The war will end someday, but what we do to each other will be remembered forever. The old warrior's voice cracked slightly. While Torres was treating me, the human I had been fighting just hours before was brought in with severe injuries. The soldier who had wounded him was my own lieutenant. Torres worked on both of us at the same time, trying to save two enemies of her people. Did they both survive? Vextar asked quietly. The human soldier died, Zethkar said. Torres worked for 6 hours trying to save him, but his injuries were too severe. When he finally passed, she cried. She cried for an enemy soldier while treating the officer who had ordered the attack that killed him. The commander finished his drink in one long swallow. That night, Torres sat with me while I recovered. She told me about her life before the war. She had been a nurse in a children's hospital. She had dedicated her life to healing people, and even war could not change that. What happened to the siege? One of the listeners asked. It continued for 3 more weeks, Zethkar said. Every day the humans found new ways to resist. Chen's devices became more sophisticated. Williams' engineering teams built weapons from classroom equipment. Stone's chemical agents became more effective. The old warrior stood up slowly. But the real victory for the humans was not military. It was moral. Every day of the siege, they showed us that they could fight without losing their humanity. They could kill without becoming killers. They could hate the war without hating their enemies. How did it end? Vextar asked. The High Command ordered a withdrawal, Zethkar said. Not because we could not take the city, but because the cost was too high. We had realized that even if we conquered New Geneva, we would never truly defeat the people who lived there. As the old commander walked toward the door, he turned back one last time. That is the most dangerous thing about humans. They do not just fight to win. They fight to remain human while winning, and that makes them impossible to truly defeat. The cantina remained silent long after Zethkar left. The story of New Geneva had shown them something about humans that was both inspiring and terrifying. Here was a species that could wage war without losing their souls, that could show mercy to enemies while fighting for their lives. The fourth night brought even more listeners to the cantina. News of Zethkar's stories had spread beyond Kepler Prime. Kalari from other ships had come to hear the old commander speak. Some had traveled for days just to listen to his tales of the human war. Zethkar looked around at the crowd. There were at least 50 beings packed into the small space. Old veterans, young soldiers, civilians, even a few government officials. All of them wanted to understand what had really happened during those terrible years. Tonight I will tell you about Titan's Gate, he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. This battle changed everything. It was where we learned that humans were not just survivors or clever fighters. It was where we discovered they had become something more dangerous than we ever imagined. The old commander waited for the room to settle before continuing. Titan's Gate was a strategic choke point between Kalari space and the human core worlds. Whoever controlled it could control the flow of ships and supplies between our territories. The High Command decided that taking Titan's Gate would end the war. How many ships did you send? One of the veterans asked. Everything, Zethkar replied simply. The largest fleet in Kalari history. 800 warships, 2 million soldiers, the finest commanders in the Dominion. We were not just trying to win a battle, we were trying to end human resistance forever. The commander's metal fingers traced patterns on the table. What we found at Titan's Gate was not what we expected. The humans were waiting for us with a fleet of only 200 ships. But these were not the same humans we had been fighting for the past 3 years. What was different about them? Vextar asked. They had learned, Zethkar said. In 3 years of war, humans had studied every weapon we used, every tactic we employed, every weakness we had shown. They had taken our technology and made it better. The old warrior's voice filled with reluctant admiration. The human fleet was commanded by Admiral Kate Sullivan. She was different from the other human commanders we had faced. Morrison fought with courage. Wright fought with cunning, but Sullivan fought with wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Someone called out. Sullivan understood that the real battle was not about destroying our fleet, Zethkar explained. It was about ending the war itself. She knew that even if she won every battle, the fighting would continue unless she could change how both sides thought about the conflict. The commander paused to take a drink. But first, she had to prove that humans could not be defeated by force alone. The battle began with our traditional tactics. We formed our ships into attack formations and prepared to overwhelm the smaller human fleet with superior numbers. What happened? One of the younger soldiers asked. Commander Eric Foster happened, Zethkar said. He led the first human squadron that could achieve faster-than-light tactical maneuvering. While our ships were still moving into position, Foster's fighters were already behind our lines, striking at our command vessels. The old commander's good eye stared into the distance. Foster had learned to use our own physics against us. He would jump his ships in short bursts, appearing and disappearing, faster than our targeting systems could track. Our gunners would fire at empty space while his pilots destroyed our weapon systems. How did they develop such technology so quickly? A government official asked. Chief Engineer Amy Walker had been studying our propulsion systems since the war began, Zethkar replied. But she did not just copy our technology, she improved it. Walker had found ways to make faster-than-light jumps more precise, more efficient, more controllable than anything we had. The commander shook his head in amazement. Walker's modifications allowed human ships to jump directly into our defensive formations, fire their weapons, and jump away before we could respond. It was like fighting ghosts that could strike from anywhere and disappear at will. What about their defenses? One of the veterans asked. That was Walker's greatest achievement, Zethkar said. She had developed new shield configurations that could turn our energy weapons back on ourselves. When we fired our plasma cannons at human ships, the energy would be absorbed and redirected back at our own vessels. The old warrior's voice grew quiet. But the most shocking thing we discovered was that not all the ships in the human fleet were crewed by humans alone. Some of them had Kalari defectors fighting alongside their former enemies. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. This was something many of them had never heard before. "How is that possible?" Vextar asked when the noise died down. Sergeant Nova Hayes and Captain Jimmy Price led mixed units of humans and Kalari who had chosen to fight against the Dominion, Zethkar explained. These were not prisoners or slaves. They were volunteers who believed that the war was wrong. Why? Would Kalari fight against their own people? Someone asked angrily. Because some of us had learned what I learned on New Geneva, Zethkar replied calmly. We had seen how humans fought, how they treated their enemies, how they tried to preserve life even in war. Some Kalari decided they wanted to be part of that kind of future. The commander's metal hand clenched. Hayes had been a communications officer on one of our ships. She had been monitoring human transmissions and began to understand their language, their culture, their way of thinking. When she realized that humans were fighting for survival while we were fighting for conquest, she made her choice. She defected? One of the officials asked. She escaped during a supply run and contacted the human fleet, Zethkar said. Instead of treating her as a prisoner, Admiral Sullivan welcomed her as an ally. Hayes provided information about our fleet movements, our communication codes, our tactical weaknesses. The old warrior's voice became heavy. Captain Price had been a ground forces commander who had witnessed the siege of New Geneva. He had seen how human civilians fought to protect their families, how they showed mercy to captured enemies, how they tried to end conflicts rather than just win them. And he joined them? Vextar whispered. Price brought his entire company with him, Zethkar said. 60 Kalari soldiers who had decided they no longer wanted to fight for the Dominion. Admiral Sullivan integrated them into her forces, gave them human ships to fly, human weapons to use. The room was completely silent now. The idea of Kalari fighting alongside humans was almost impossible for many of them to understand. During the battle, these mixed units were the most effective forces on either side, Zethkar continued. They knew how we thought, how we fought, how we would react to different situations. They could predict our moves before we made them. How did the battle end? One of the veterans asked. With a human victory that should have been impossible, Zethkar replied. Our fleet of 800 ships was defeated by 200 human vessels. But the real shock came after the battle was over. The commander finished his drink before continuing. Admiral Sullivan could have pressed her advantage. She could have pursued our retreating ships, could have struck deep into Kalari space, could have ended the Dominion's ability to make war. Instead, she did something that no Kalari commander would have done. What? Several voices asked at once. She offered to help, Zethkar said simply. Sullivan sent medical ships to treat our wounded, rescue ships to save our survivors, supply ships to provide food and water for our damaged vessels. She treated our defeated fleet not as conquered enemies, but as fellow beings in need of assistance. The old warrior stood up slowly. I was on one of the ships that Sullivan's people rescued. My vessel had been crippled during the battle, life support failing, crew dying. A human medical ship docked with us, and their doctors worked for 12 hours to save my soldiers. Why would they do that, someone asked. Because Sullivan understood something that our leaders did not, Zethkar replied. She knew that the war would not end with victory or defeat. It would only end when both sides chose to stop fighting. The commander walked toward the center of the room so everyone could see him. After the rescue operations were complete, Sullivan opened a communication channel to our fleet commander. She said something that changed the course of the war. What did she say? Vextar asked. She said, Admiral, we have both lost too many good people in this conflict. We can continue fighting until one of us has nothing left, or we can start talking about how to build a future where our children do not have to fight each other. The choice is yours. The old warrior's voice cracked slightly. Our admiral, a veteran of 50 campaigns, a warrior who had never shown weakness in his entire career, began to cry. Not from defeat, but from relief. Relief that someone was finally offering a way out of the endless cycle of violence. What happened then? One of the government officials asked. Sullivan and our admiral talked for 6 hours, Zethkar said. Not about surrender or conquest, but about peace. About how two different species could share the galaxy without destroying each other. About how the strengths of both peoples could be used to build something better than either could achieve alone. The commander looked around at all the faces watching him. That conversation led to the armistice, then to the peace negotiations, then to the treaties that govern our relationship. Today, all because one human admiral chose to offer help instead of delivering a final blow. The fifth night brought the largest crowd yet to the cantina. Word had spread across multiple star systems about Zethkar's stories. Beings from a dozen different species had come to hear the final tale. The cantina owner had moved tables outside to accommodate everyone who wanted to listen. Zethkar looked out at the sea of faces. Kalari, humans, and other species all sat together, waiting for his words. For the first time in weeks, he saw humans in his audience. They had come to hear what a former enemy thought about their people. Tonight I will tell you about the end, he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Not the end of the war, but the end of hatred. I will tell you about Luna Station, where enemies became partners, where old wounds began to heal, where the future was built from the ashes of the past. The old commander's metal hand reflected the cantina lights as he gestured. The peace negotiations took place on Luna Station, orbiting Earth's moon. It was neutral ground, built specifically for the talks. I was there as a military advisor to the Kalari delegation. What was it like? Vextar asked. He had been to every one of Zethkar's stories, hanging on every word. Tense, Zethkar replied simply. We were all warriors who had spent years trying to kill each other. Now we were sitting around conference tables trying to find words instead of using weapons. It was the hardest thing any of us had ever done. The commander paused, remembering. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Carlos Martinez. He was not a soldier. He had been a teacher before the war, then a diplomat during the conflict. Martinez understood that making peace was more difficult than making war. Why was it more difficult? One of the human listeners asked. Because in war you only have to defeat your enemy, Zethkar explained. In peace you have to understand them. You have to find ways to live together, work together, trust each other. That takes more courage than any battle. The old warriors' voice grew thoughtful. The Kalari delegation was led by Elder Prime Kethanol, the most experienced diplomat in our government. But even Kethanol struggled with the idea of treating humans as equals rather than conquered subjects. What made the negotiations so complicated? Someone called out. Everything, Zethkar said. We had to decide what would happen to captured soldiers, to occupied territories, to war crimes committed by both sides. We had to create new laws for trade, travel, communication between our species. We had to build trust where there had been only fear. The commander took a sip of his drink. General Linda Ross led the human military delegation. She was a woman who had lost everything in the war. Her husband, her children, her home world had all been destroyed in Kalari attacks. She had every reason to hate us. Did she? Vexatar asked quietly. No, Zethkar said, and there was wonder in his voice. Ross worked harder than anyone to make the peace talks succeed. She would spend 18 hours a day in meetings, reviewing documents, finding compromises that both sides could accept. She never spoke of her personal losses, never demanded revenge for what had been taken from her. The old warrior's good eye glistened. I asked her once why she worked so hard for peace when she had suffered so much. She told me that her family had died fighting for a better future. The best way to honor their memory was to make sure that future became real. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the sounds from the station corridor seemed muted. Dr. Tony Clark was the human war crimes investigator, Zethkar continued. His job was to document the terrible things that had happened during the war, to identify those responsible, to recommend punishments. It was a job that could have destroyed any hope for peace. How did he handle it? One of the government officials asked. with wisdom beyond his years, Zethkar replied. Clark investigated every crime reported by both sides. He did not try to hide human mistakes or excuse Kalari brutality. He simply sought the truth no matter how painful it was. The commander's voice became heavier. Clark's report showed that both sides had committed acts we were not proud of. Soldiers who had killed prisoners, commanders who had targeted civilians, officials who had ordered the destruction of non-military targets. What happened to those people? Someone asked. Judge Patricia Moore oversaw the war crimes tribunals, Zethkar said. She was fair but firm with everyone who came before her court. Kalari and human criminals received equal justice. But Moore also established rehabilitation programs, cultural exchange initiatives, ways for those who had done wrong to make amends. The old warrior stood up and walked among the crowd as he spoke. Moore understood that punishment alone would not heal the wounds of war. She created programs where former enemies worked together on humanitarian projects, building hospitals, schools, research stations. She turned guilt into positive action. Did it work? Vextar asked. Better than anyone expected, Zethkar replied. Some of the most effective peacekeeping teams were made up of former war criminals who had found ways to use their skills for construction instead of destruction. The commander stopped walking and faced the crowd. But the most important person in the negotiations was not a diplomat or a judge or a general. It was Captain Jake Morrison. A murmur went through the crowd. Morrison was the human from Zethkar's first story, the mining engineer who had held off an entire Kalari battalion. Morrison had become a teacher after the war. Zethkar explained. He ran programs that brought young humans and Kalari together to learn about each other's cultures, languages, ways of thinking. His students were the first generation to grow up seeing former enemies as potential friends. What was he like in person? One of the younger listeners asked. Tired, Zethkar said simply. The war had aged him. He walked with a limp from old
injuries, spoke quietly because of damage to his throat from breathing toxic gases. But his eyes still held the same determination I had seen 30 years earlier. The old commander's voice became soft with memory. I met Morrison on the last
day of the negotiations. The treaties had been signed, the ceremonies completed, the future secured. He was standing alone on an observation deck looking out at Earth. What did you say to him? Vextar whispered. I thanked him. Zethkar replied. I told him that his courage at Zerion 7 had started a chain of events that led to peace between our peoples. I said that without his example, the war might have gone very differently. The commander paused, his voice thick with emotion. Morrison looked at me with those strange human eyes and said something I will never forget. He said, Commander, we did not fight you because we hated you. We fought you because we had to. Now we have the chance to build something better together. That is what makes all the pain worthwhile. A human in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes. Several Kalari clicked their mandibles in the gesture of deep respect. Morrison's students were already working on joint projects. Zethkar continued. Human and Kalari teams exploring new worlds together, building research stations, sharing technology and knowledge. They were creating the future that their elders had only dreamed of. The old warrior returned to his table and sat down heavily. That is why I tell these stories to young soldiers, not to frighten you or make you proud, but to help you understand what we learned during those terrible years. What did you learn? Vextar asked. That humans are not our enemies, Zethkar said. They never were. They were just beings trying to protect their families, their homes, their way of life. When we stopped trying to conquer them and started trying to understand them, everything changed. The commander looked around at all the faces watching him, human and alien alike. The humans taught us that strength is not about domination. It is about protection. They showed us that victory is not about defeating your enemies. It is about turning them into friends. What about the Kalari who still distrust humans? One of the officials asked. I tell them what Morrison told me, Zethkar replied. We have the chance to build something better together. The war is over. The hatred can end. The future belongs to those brave enough to choose cooperation over conflict. The old warrior stood up one final time. You younglings will inherit the galaxy that we built from the ashes of war. Human and Kalari ships explore together, trade together, learn together. Our children study in each other's schools, work on each other's worlds, marry across species lines. Is that what you wanted when the war began? Vextar asked. No, Zethkar said honestly. When the war began, I wanted conquest. I wanted to prove Kalari superiority. I wanted to expand our empire across the galaxy. But the humans taught me to want something better. The old commander walked toward the door, his metal leg whirring softly. They taught me to want a future where young beings like yourselves never have to learn the lessons I learned, where differences are celebrated instead of feared, where former enemies become partners in building something greater than either could achieve alone. As Zethkar reached the door, he turned back one final time. That is the most dangerous thing about humans. They do not just fight for survival. They fight for the right to dream of a better tomorrow, and they have the courage to make those dreams real. The cantina remained silent long after the old commander left. Outside the windows, human and Kalari ships moved through space together, carrying crews of both species to distant worlds.